Hi and welcome back to Forum Chess Club. Today we are going to take a look at some very interesting ideas in the Sicilian, particularly an aggressive sideline for white that gives him opportunities to take black out of theory and set up an unclear position. Let's take a look. The Sicilian defense begins with the move pawn e2 to e4, then pawn to c5. With this little pawn to c5 move, black is anticipating white attempts to play for d2 to d4. Now, black's idea here is very clever. He knows that in order for white to give his pieces full scope, he will definitely wants to play d2 to d4 at some point. But at the moment, black is prepared to capture with the flank pawn as opposed to a central pawn. Why it is so important that black is ready to capture with the flank pawn? Because black would then end up with two center pawn to the white one center pawn. This is really useful if eventually black decides to attack the center or simply retain white pieces from capturing the center squares. We will get a chance to see plenty of other videos with some ideas where white plays his most popular moves. But today, we take a look at really interesting alternative to the main line. Instead of knight to f3 and then playing d2 to d4. We will get a chance to see plenty of other ideas like this, but today we take a look at really interesting alternative to the main lines, which begins fittingly enough with the move pawn to c3. Now with this little move pawn to c3, white is going to foil black intention of gaining a centered pawn majority. That because by preparing d2 to d4, in this way white guarantees that he will be able to capture with the pawn after black captures d4. That way he will still have two center pawns. This is very ambitious strategy by white and also has a lot of advantages of avoiding a lot of theory. But let's see if we can identify any drawbacks to this move. Opening principles say that in general we should try to avoid making too many pawn moves in the opening. Instead we should try to get our pieces out as quickly as possible. But with the white move pawn c2 to c3 doesn't develop a piece, and just as importantly, it temporarily deprives the knight on b1 of its most natural square to c3. In a way then the move c3 is little bit slow, and this allows black to play actively and try to irritate white with some rapid play. So one popular and rather strong response to c3 Sicilian is for black to play pawn to d5. Now notice that after the necessary moves pawn takes a pawn and queen takes pawn, black is already taking advantage of the knight inability to reach the c3 square and disturb the queen with a gain of time. So white often plays pawn to d4 here, and this leads to a really interesting strategic situation. White has achieved a space advantage but has not really succeeded at gaining the sort of ideal pawn center he had hoped for. Instead, black can at any time gives white a weak pawn on d4 by playing pawn takes pawn. Often black delays this for just a moment, but for learning purpose, let's see how this works right away. So I'm going to show right now pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Now with that, we have right here is what is known as the isolated queen's pawn position. I know that sounds fancy, but that is just a very complicated way of saying that the d4 pawn is isolated. There is no pawn to the right or to the left. There is no c pawn or the d pawn for white. That means that he has no way of defending the d4 pawn with a pawn. This makes the pawn isolated, and it also creates a weak square on d5. Black will try to use both of these factors. He will try to prove that d4 pawn is weak, and he will also use the d5 square as an outpost. So there are two little bonuses for black in this position, but before we count white out, we better realize that there are some really great things going on for white here too. Notice that his pieces all have ton of scope. Let's take a look. Both of these white bishops have a great scope, both on the dark square and on the light square. White did just get the c3 square back for his knight, and he is going to get that square with a gain of time. There is also an outpost for his pieces on the c5 and on the e5, and he has also an open file on the c and e. So these are all the two open files for white. So it is turns out the isolated queen pawn situation gives white great attacking chances, but it also yields black great chances, since he may consolidate his position and then proves that d4 pawn is weak. So now backing up a little before pawn takes pawn, black normally delays capturing for a while on the d4 because there is no hurry and there is no reason to give white the square on c3 for his knight until it is necessary to do so. So black normally continues by developing one of his knight. So in this case, we are going to take a look at a popular book line, knight to f6. White often continues his own development with knight to f3. One of the most common reply is a bishop to g4 and then bishop to e2. Bishop to e6, while white can castle on the king side, knight to c6 and then bishop to e3. Now, at this moment, white finally has a real threat to capture on c5. If white captures on c5, there is no way black is going to recover that pawn. So it is time for black to finally give white the lead with a pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn, bishop to e7. White gives this square of his knight with a temple. And now queen to d6. If you look at this position, both sides have a lot of reasons to be happy. White has completed his development very naturally and he is even gained a little tide at the expense of black queen. He has also opened files. He has a wide sense of active play here. However, the beautiful thing in chess is that unless we have made a serious mistake, we almost always have some serious traps of our own. If only we can manage to neutralize our opponent trumps. So it is here, if I am playing black, I know that if I play very carefully, white may fail to get much out of his slight advantages in the space and development. Once that happens, we will not only have an equal game, but I will be much better. That's because the pawn which is on the d4 will prove to be the weakness as the game moves on. So the move pawn to d5 leads to interesting play for both the sides. Both the sides find comfortable squares for their pieces and the game becomes very interesting and complex, leading to an isolated queen pawn situation. It is not clear who is better in the situation and white's not exactly pushing black around. However, he does avoid a lot of theory and he get a very complex game for both the sides. The other popular idea for black that I would like to show you is quite a bit different and it begins with the move knight to f6. With this move, black takes a different tactics. He's still dead set on exploiting the unusual features of white move pawn to c3. After the inevitable pawn to e5, knight to d5. The presence of black knight in the center is actually a serious annoyance for white. Now there are two reasons for this. Usually the knight can't live here long because for the obvious move c2 to c4. But here there are two major drawbacks of kicking this knight out. One is that white has already consumed a temple, bringing the pawn to c3. Another is that there is a pawn on c5 here, which is making it pretty unattractive. Let's say that the white plays c4. It is a kind of unattractive here that it's going to be difficult for white to play d4. So his pawns are kind of a split up, and the c5 does a beautiful job of keeping the white structure under check here. For these reasons, white doesn't have any such advantage in easy time in ejecting the knight on d5. And this is the one way that he's taking advantage of the c2 to c3 move. Now, white has advanced a pawn on e5. And this gives him a definite space advantage. But if you have been watching some of these kind of similar videos, you will know by now that while it's critical to advance our pawns to cram the opponent, win territory, and eventually threaten to make queens, pawn advances always come at a cost. One such cost is that pawns themselves may turn out to be vulnerable to direct attack, and sometimes that proves to be the case here too. Black is going to try and break this pawn down with d7 to d6. And he is going to try, he's going to try to exchange the pawn off and leaves white vulnerable and have wasted time as well. So still, white has space and black position is little unstable. So white has some exciting options here too. Let's take a look at the typical moves. Pawn to d4, pawn takes pawn. Now since this pawn is currently pinned, white doesn't actually recapture just yet. He plays knight to f3 and then knight to c6. Now, white has two major ideas. White has got to be realistic and ask himself some tough questions here. He got to say to himself, I can't successfully maintain the pawn in the center. Black is definitely going to succeed in exchanging my central pawn sooner or later. using the break d7 to d6. So how can I aim for an advantage? Well, the answer it turns out, is that white can aim to develop his pieces quickly and aggressively, taking advantage of the d5 knight and supported placement in the meantime. Over the years, white player in this position have come up with the two major ways of going about this. One interesting way is to play the position as a gambit, sacrificing a pawn with a move bishop to c4, then knight to b6, bishop to b3. So in this variation, for a long time, white is going to allow black the option of taking on c3. But the reason that this will give him even more scope for his pieces and a huge lead in the development. Plus, he will still have this cramping pawn on e5. In fact, black rarely captures that, but instead he continues his development with the outstanding move pawn to d5. In order for white to get an advancement or advantage, he definitely has to remove this pawn, because black just getting too much share of the center, and if he is allowed to keep that pawn. So white captures using the en passant rule, pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, and now white castles, again giving black an option to capture on c3. But again, black typically ignores this and continues his development with the outstanding move bishop to e6. Black's getting closer and closer to the developing his position meaningfully, but still he has done nothing about the development of his king side pieces, and he is not exactly castled either. So white normally still gets interesting play here, using such moves as knight to a3, which aims to bring his knight to one of the key squares. Now black finally does in fact captures on c3. White avoids the trade of queen with the move queen to e2, and now black often plays bishop take bishop. In this crazy aggressive move, knight b5, which not only attacks the queen but which is also trying to bring the knight into the c7 square. So black has to back the queen with up to the b8 here, and white recaptures the bishop. This is very interesting position. At this moment, black is ahead, not one but 2 pawns, but his pieces are making a very unfavorable impression here. The position is highly unclear, and this is just the sort of dynamic, interesting position White was hoping for when he played the c3 Sicilian. However, black, if he is prepared, shouldn't have to be too worried about this position. As inspiring players, we can help ourselves a lot by having positions like this and work at them persistence, sometimes with both sides to improve the game. So I'm going to leave that position there, which is really interesting, and we are going to go back to the moment where I said that white has two options right after this move knight to c6. White has other ways to reach an imbalanced game without gambiting a pawn. They begin with the book move, pawn takes pawn, and then now pawn to d6. Now, white threatens to reduce white's special advantage significantly. To avoid giving black a dream position, white intends to defend his center using the clever pin bishop to b5. In this way, he reduces the attackers on the e5, since the knight can't participate in the control of e5. However, if white were to play this move right away, he would get stuck by an ugly move here. Can you see the tactic? Yes, it is queen to a5 check, which attacks both the king and the bishop. This is really unpleasant situation for white here. He would probably lose material with the move knight to c3, and now knight takes c3, and this is just a bad situation for poor white. He can probably minimize his losses with bishop takes knight, check, takes, and takes. But he's just dropping material here, and this position has no track records whatsoever, so white can't just go ahead and play this move bishop to e5 8. However, he has another little intermediate move he can play first, which is very clever. First, he attacks on c4, and only after black's standard reaction to knight to b6 does white now pin the knight on c6. So, after pawn takes pawn, white now recaptures the knight, and we have seen this isolated pawn position before. White has scope for his pieces, and he's got a little annoying thread on the c6 at the moment. So after the move bishop to d7, we have another unbalanced position here. Clearly black is threatening knight takes e5, which would win a piece. So white has to make a capture here. One example of how we can go about this is an example: knight take bishop, queen takes knight to e3, e6, and then castle. The position is unclear, White has the standard pawn weaknesses on the d4, but he does maintain the space advantage and he does have the bishop here. So plenty of interesting chess going on here. These are the positions I wanted to show today. We have accomplished a number of things. We have taken a look at the particularly aggressive system of for white against the Sicilian, in which white aims to avoid allowing black one of his pet system and one of his pet ideas of achieving a center pawn majority. So we have found that white does get some very unbalanced positions, sometimes around the isolated queen pawn, or sometimes around gambiting a pawn. In all these cases, black is okay, but the position is unclear, and whoever turns out to be more prepared has a great chance of winning. So there is a lot of great material, and I recommend taking a look at these positions from both the sides and see if maybe you are wanting to try them out sometime. That's it for today, and I look forward to see you again with another opening. Thank you for watching.